Hi, everyone. So we will be talking about the history of education in schools for Native Americans population and Indian boarding schools. I'm Anna.
I'm Gabby.
I'm Kate.
I'm Etsenia.
And I'm Shawen.
For the group activity, what do you know about the history and current state of education for Native American population? What do you want to learn? So take about 3 minutes to jot down everything you know or you may think that you know. So take a few minutes and then we'll come back, okay?
Yeah, you guys can pause the video while you do that, and then we'll continue.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So there were opportunities for American schooling for the Native Americans dating all the way back from 1716, where either religious institutions or colleges simply offered to take in Native American students, to which the tribes kindly declined. The reason for doing so stated that some of their people actually did attend a college, but came back far removed from nature and were useless to the tribe's way of living. It wasn't until 1860 when the first federal boarding school was created on the Yakima Indian Reservation in Washington. In the next 5 years, Chemawa Indian School in Oregon, Haskell Institute in Kansas, and Chilocco Indian School in Oklahoma were also opened. The Yakima Indian Reservation was established by Eastern reformers Herbert Welsh and Henry Pancoast as part of a plan to assimilate Indian tribes into the mainstream of the American way of life. This was a common Protestant ideology in the mid-19th century, and by the 1880s, there were 60 schools for 6,200 Indian students, consisting of reservation day schools and reservation boarding schools. These schools wanted to produce students that were economically self-sufficient by teaching work skills and also instilling values and beliefs of possessive individualism. This means that you care about yourself and what you as a person own, which was the opposite of the Indian belief that the land was for all people. Colonel Richard Pratt created the first off-reservation boarding school in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Carlisle was the only off-reservation boarding school built in the East, while all others were built in the West. His motive for doing so came from his experiences leading his cavalry and seeing the injustices to Indians and Blacks. He announced on the So Trail that he created a school to allow Indian children to be able to live among white men without prejudice, meaning that they'll be able to walk among white men and be able to work alongside them. In the better boarding schools, the children were able to attain a reasonable degree of English literacy in a relatively short period. At other schools, though, the method of teaching was in object cards such as cat shown to students were then written, pronounced, and traced. However, this failed to produce a comprehension of those words which had no equivalent in their native tongue. Despite aiming to teach the native children, these schools had a pattern of abuse, and in the Phoenix Indian School, a case of measles broke out in December of 1999, which reached epidemic proportions by January. There were other diseases included, however, the greatest threats were tuberculosis and trachoma. Although Carlisle and Phoenix did include extracurricular activities such as band and debate, in the end, the schools simply aimed to strip the children of their Native American attributes. From the 1860s to the 1970s, instruction was delivered by nuns or other persons of good moral character. 1/3 of Indian boarding schools were managed by Christians or Catholics. Additionally, teachers were almost always white, and their role was to make sure the Native American students' culture was erased. The students' hair was cut short, they were only allowed to speak English rather than their native tongues, and they were given new American names. Additionally, teachers were not educated on Native American culture and viewed their students as stupid and uncultured. They also did not often have teaching degrees due to limited funding given to the Indian boarding schools. Teachers viewed their roles to civilize students rather than to educate them. The curriculum did not teach Native American students basic math or English and focused instead on economic practicality. They were taught industrial skills so that they could perform manual labor to keep the schools running. Teachers also taught American history with a white bias, emphasizing to Native American students that they were considered uncivilized. Some students were also
physically and verbally abused, and there was a major emphasis on discipline and punishment. From the 1970s and now today, instruction was primarily delivered by public school teachers or by teachers living on Native American reservations. However, these teachers may not be licensed to teach all grades, but are tasked with doing so anyway. Native American students are still disciplined at much higher rates in public schools than white students and have a much higher dropout rate. American history continues to be taught with a white bias, so Native American students do not have a lot of opportunities to learn about their culture. And additionally, many Native American communities still mistrust teachers and the American education system because of how they have historically been treated. There is a serious lack of Native American educators, and this also makes it difficult for Native American students to connect with their teachers.
So why learning have made it look like this way? Well, most schools were underfunded and way understaffed. They didn't really care about how the Native American schools were set up. They were mostly under control by trying to get rid of their language, the culture. The boarding school was more of a military style. They were under really strict rules. They had to wear uniform. They had to march in formation, and they also had discipline. And when the rules was broken, they had serious consequences. In general, they were mostly being groomed in order to be able to civilize them or like control them, to get rid of all the culture background. And as they said before, most of the time we're mostly spent on maintaining the school, fixing the shoes and clothes and all that. And the parents had to send the school to boarding school because of the lack of school, or there wasn't any school available for them. And in the picture, you can see the Carlise Indian School. That was like the #1 boarding school that they would send them to. And the other picture is when it's a picture of the children doing hard labor, and yeah.
So now we're going to talk about the lasting impacts of this time period on the current education system. But first, we're going to start off by going over the pros and cons of these boarding schools in that time period. So while doing my research, it was really hard to find pros because of the lasting impacts, the negative lasting impacts on these Native Americans, but during that time, they had access to education to what seemed more valuable to the white counterparts. They learned trades and practical skills, such as agriculture, carpentry, printing, and cooking, which they already knew according to their culture, but because of the colonization moving more Western, they emphasized what was more important to them that would be more valuable to live amongst the white people. And the food and shelter during this time was really limited to many of the Native Americans because they were pushed onto these reservations where they weren't really familiar with the land. So it was an opportunity for these children to have these resources. But for the cons, the militarization of the boarding schools had a really bad effect on their self-esteem, and it continues to do so to the Native American children now today while they attend these public schools, because like Caitlin said, they are often times more punished on a more severe level rather, well, in comparison to their white peers. And the restrictions on practicing their native language and culture also played a huge role in their self-esteem, and they were really disconnected with their roots. There were harsher punishments because they were seen as savages during the time because they wanted to enforce the assimilation with the white people. There was child labor because they were understaffed. The children oftentimes did the cleaning, the cooking, and the labor around the schools. And there was disease outbreak because of the environments where the women, well, the girls and the boys, they all had their own dormitories, but because they were so crowded and there wasn't enough space, it was easier for the disease outbreaks to happen. So on the top, my top left, there's a student who is writing and printing, which was one of the tasks or one of the skills that they learned at these trade schools. And at the bottom, they are playing baseball, which was one of the activities that they encouraged because it was part of the dominant culture at the time. And on my top right, we see a child in their native attire, and then after years of going to the boarding school, they cut their hair and have them in more Western outfits. And at the bottom right, they're holding American flags to assimilate with the culture that was prominent at the time.
Okay, so going further on the lasting negative impacts in the public school system and probably in the private school systems. From my experience personally, there has always been a lack of focus on Native American history. Native Americans play such a small part in our educational system, especially in the US. And due to the lack of information we are taught about them, we tend to forget that they were the first, original Americans. And especially in this time in society where race, ethnicity, and nationality divide us, I believe it would benefit the youth of today being taught the true history of our country. And there is so much from that time period that can be pulled and used today that will improve the educational system. So a statistic I found from 2011, which didn't surprise me, but I thought would be important to show, was that 27 states in the US did not mention any individual Native Americans in the K through 12 standards, and 87% of the state history standards did not cover Native American history after the 1900s. But there are over 5 million Native Americans belonging to 573 nations throughout the US today. So, ways to expand the Native American history in school, it's of course up to the educator to find and pull, history from that time period into the curriculums for K through 12 classrooms. So an example I found would be like teaching a science unit on astrophysics, but instead of talking about the person, Neil Armstrong, there are others in the Native American community that have been involved in space and astrophysics, like the Chickasaw astronaut John Harrington. And of course, another approach is to bring original sourcing, find people who are in the educational department that are Native American to come to your schools and talk to the students and really bring Native American history throughout the whole school year instead of just talking about it during, Thanksgiving and etc.
So for the group activity, what have you learned about the history, current state of education for Native American populations? How is this different from what you thought at the beginning of the presentation? Take a few minutes to write down your thoughts. And you can pause the video if you'd like. And yeah, that's a presentation. Thank you guys.